Thanks everyone for sticking around to the last session. This is work funded by NCVER, and I'm very grateful to NCVER, not just for the funding but also for the research support that I get. The thing about working with NCVER is that they understand research, and that makes it much easier for a researcher to actually interact and come up with a product that is both interesting but also thorough. So some caveats today. First of all, I need to say that this is just preliminary analysis. So I have other studies that are similar that I'll talk about briefly that are available online. This research is just preliminary. I think our draft report is due in August sometime, so you shouldn't really quote this stuff because it may well change between now and then. The other caveat is that I put these slides together after a 36-hour flight from Montreal, and there may be a few errors in there, but I'll iron them out hopefully as I go along. So first of all, globalisation and increasingly rapid technological change means that skills are becoming perishable in the modern age. And what this really means is that instead of just investing in skills at the start, when you're young, you're going to have to invest. A lot of people have to invest in skills throughout a life course. And what that means for the vet sector is that skills have to really be, enrolments really have to be related to skill demand. So if the sector is really going to take people from sectors where there is waning skills and move them into areas of growth, the sector really does have to respond to skill demands. And this has been highlighted in numerous reports, including a report by the OECD on learning for jobs. Now, the issue is particularly pertinent for English-speaking countries where there isn't really a clear market signal about what skills are in demand. So in countries like Germany, when you have apprenticeship system, you have a very clear match between skill demand and skill supply. So in other words, the availability of your place in training in the apprenticeship scheme is really rationed by the willingness of employers to take on apprentices, and that sends a very clear signal about what the demands for certain skills are. In English-speaking countries, yes, we have an apprenticeship system, but much of our training is outside of the apprenticeship system. And in these areas where you have training that's based mainly classroom-based, there is a real issue in how to send the right signals to the market. And traditionally, what happens is that governments take on this role. So governments act as the purchaser of vet, and they make decisions about which courses to invest in based on what they think the skill demands are. And this model has been criticised not just in Australia but also internationally, and it's very common in these countries to experience ongoing skill shortages and skill mismatch. So Australia's response really has been, by international standards, as being revolutionary. And it was spelt out under the National Agreement for Skills and Workforce Development. And under this, which was really batted out as part of a COAG agreement, basically VET in each state moved from a supply-driven model where governments decided where the funding went to a model of a VET entitlement. And you can think of this VET entitlement as for all intents and purposes, as a voucher. So now the funding follows student choice. And there's really three things that this meant. It meant, first of all, that instead of funding being capped according to budget allocations, funding was no longer capped. So there's no longer a fixed number of places available in VET. Secondly, public funding, as I said, follows student choice now, not what governments think where the skills really are, skill demands are, I should say. And thirdly, competition for public funding from private providers was introduced in the market, which has never really, there has been some public providers competing for funds in the apprenticeship system, but that's only a relatively small part of the overall sector. And the other thing to say about these reforms is that they were state-based. So I understand that in each state they did things a bit differently, and I'm not going to talk about the arrangements in every state. I'm really only going to talk about arrangements in one state, which is Victoria, and I'll explain why in a second. But I guess the key question that we're trying to get at this study is, does this model of student demand-driven funding actually improve the responsiveness of VET to skill needs? And it's not really clear a priori before we did this research what the answer would be. Because on the one hand, you could argue that governments really do have the best information about what skill demands are, and so governments should be in the best place to hand out the cash. But alternatively, you could argue that students actually, maybe they don't have skill forecasts at the tips of their fingers, but they do have an interest, a vested interest in working out what skill demands are. And sometimes they might even have better information about what the local skill demands are. The other thing about students is that they're less likely to be swayed by powerful interests. When I say powerful interests, I mean you only have to think about the reaction of the mining sector to these reforms. The mining sector hated them. And one of the reasons why the mining sector hated these reforms is because they lost control. No longer could they directly lobby government to get extra funding for places in the mining sector. So the aim of the study is really to look at student choices, but in this study I'm really focusing on the 25 to 54-year-old age group. We've already done some analysis on the 15 to 19-year-olds. The mature age context is important. So people who come into training between ages of 25 and 54, they've already had they've had more life experiences, but they're also more constrained in their choices because some of them have already made investments in occupations or in industry. So their choices are likely to be quite different to the 15 to 19-year-olds. So the relevant literature, again, I just want to give a short plug for the previous work that I've done with Duncan McVicker from the University of Belfast, looking at the 15 to 19-year-olds. Overall, what we found is that it did lead to an improvement. These reforms did lead to an improvement in the alignment between skill supply and skill demand. So students were making good choices, even though they're only 15 to 19-year-olds, they were responding to market signals about what the skill demands were. In fact, they're responding in a way that actually led to an improvement in responsiveness of the sector. So if you're interested, you can find this study on the Melbourne Institute website. It's a working paper. The only other study that I'll allude to is one by Schwert, which is in Switzerland they introduced a voucher scheme that was not dissimilar to the one in Australia, but it was much smaller. So it was only restricted to older workers and it was only a very small system. It was only a very small voucher targeted at specific groups. So the key research questions are, to what extent do entitlements increase engagement in VET among mature age? Do entitlements improve the alignment between course choice and skill needs among the mature age? And do disadvantaged groups, do they respond in the same ways? Disadvantaged groups, do they respond in the same way as the rest of the community? And this is important because evidence from the literature in school choice shows that people from disadvantaged backgrounds don't tend to take advantage of the freedoms to choose private schools under a voucher scheme in the US. And that's because the literature suggests that people from disadvantaged backgrounds don't have the same access to information and they don't respond in the same way because they have other priorities. So disadvantage is really important in the study, I think. So what do? So we just focus on the Victorian Training Guarantee, and the reason why we do this is really because the VTG was the first, so that means we can compare the outcomes in Victoria to outcomes that happened over that same period in other states to try and isolate the causal effect of these reforms. The responses are measured in both VET participation and also the alignment of enrolments with skill demands, and we apply what's called a difference in difference approach, and I'll talk you through that in a second. What the VTG meant. So basically, as I've said before, it meant uncapping places in VET in Victoria. It meant greater access of course choice. Before the reforms, if you wanted to go and say become a hairdresser, you might apply to the local TAFE. If they didn't have a publicly funded place available, maybe you'd have to do beauty therapy, or maybe you had to cross town to find a place in hairdressing. And it's not a very good example, but because hairdressing is part of an apprenticeship system, but you get the gist of the story. So this really gave students more greater availability of choice. But for 25 to 54-year-olds in Victoria, they were subject to an upskilling requirement. So it meant that they had to do a course that was at a higher level to get access to the publicly funded course. There were some exemptions. Foundation courses were exempt. People with special circumstances were exempt, such as people who were refugees, and also apprentices were exempt as well. And of course, the other part of the reforms is that students could freely enrol in a course with a public provider.
Could you explain that last point on the
Sure.
slide?
So the last point was that basically that students now could enrol in a publicly funded place with a private provider. Okay, so I talked about the 36-hour flight. That's what happens. Vet participation. So the data that we used was from the National Vet Provider Collection. It's population data of everyone enrolled in a publicly funded course in Australia. It's fantastic data. The only problem with it is that it doesn't include fee-for-service data. And for that reason, we also use data from the ABS survey of education, not employment, survey of education and work. So this is an alternative data set that we used. And the reason why we use this is it asks people about participation in any type of vet, not just in publicly funded vet. And the reason why we're worried about this is because there's the possibility that what students did is that they actually just substituted public for private. So instead of enrolling in a fee-for-service course, they enrolled in a public funded course. But the overall effect on enrolment may well be negligible. So we used an alternative data source to try and get at whether there was actually any substitution happening between public and fee-for-service. And because we were interested in participation, we also we used estimates from census. Course choice data, again, it's the VET PC data, and it's linked to course level skill demand information available at the time of enrolment. That's how we worked out whether students were actually choosing courses, more likely to choose courses related to skill demand. And we have two measures of skill demand. One is whether the course is linked to a national skills shortage list. I think everyone kind of understands the concept of a skills shortage list. It's just a list of occupations that the government thinks is in demand. And the other one is basically outcomes from courses, the expected outcomes from different courses. And we take that from the graduate survey, which is the student outcomes survey. So two measures of skill demand, outcomes, expected outcomes from the course, and also skill shortage information. Estimation, I'll talk you through this quickly. This is nice to be able to talk about difference and difference because I don't have to use any econometrics. I can just explain what I did using graphs. Difference and difference is really easy. Basically what it means is that you've got outcomes tracked over time. You've got outcomes from a pre-reform period. This is prior to the reforms, and outcomes after. This is our period of reform. This is the drawing to explain it. There's no data. You've got New South Wales, which is our counterfactual. This is Victoria, where the reforms take place. You've got a variable of interest. Let's say it's proportion of enrolments in skill shortage areas. At the reform, there's a break associated with the reform. In the post-reform period in New South Wales, where nothing happened, things just track along nicely as they were. So what we do is when we estimate any causal effects of a policy change, what we need to know is what's the counterfactual. What would have happened in Victoria if these reforms didn't take place? And under difference and difference, we assume that in Victoria, if these reforms didn't take place, the trend would have been the same as in New South Wales. So we apply the New South Wales trend to Victoria, estimate the change relative to between pre-reform, post-reform, and this bit here is really the estimated impact of the reform. So this is what we call the difference and difference. Easy, yeah? So overall, we just some details about how we actually did the estimation. So we restrict the analysis to the first half of the year enrolments. Pre-reform period is 2006-2008. Post-reform is January-June 2010 to the same period in 2012. Use data from New South Wales to generate counterfactuals. Estimate with and without individual provider control. So one of the things we try, when we estimate the overall effects, the other thing we want to do is try and estimate what the mechanism through which these effects happened. And there may be a number of ways, a number of causal mechanisms. One may be just through changes in the composition of the student body. Another may be changes in the composition of the providers. So we know after these reforms that a lot of private providers came in the market. And we want to sort of tease out to see whether that was one of the mechanisms through which the impacts occurred. And what is remaining is what we estimate to be the overall effect of giving students greater freedom of choice. And so anytime you do this type of analysis, everyone knows that it's a bit of a leap of faith to assume that Victoria's outcomes would have followed those of New South Wales if the reforms weren't implemented. So we do some tests to try and to see whether that's a valid assumption. One thing we do is to see whether there are differences in historical trends prior to the reforms. If Victoria and New South Wales are trending in these outcomes pretty much in the same way over time, then we've got no reason to believe that in the absence of these reforms that things may have been different. So then that would give us some reason or confidence to believe that the assumption that the trends would have followed New South Wales is valid. The other thing that we do is we also construct alternative counterfactuals. So instead of choosing New South Wales, we choose the rest of Australia as the control group. And finally, even if you don't believe us, then what we do is we construct analysis just on Albury-Wodonga, either side of the Murray River. In Albury, which is on the New South Wales side, thank you, they were not affected by the reforms. On the other side of the river, in Albury-Wodonga, they were affected by the reforms. And so you can we can say these are, we can rule out diverging trends. And we can cleanly estimate the impacts of the reform either side of the Murray. We've done this in previous studies, if you're interested too. So just enrolments, what we saw is for 25, 54-year-olds in Victoria, you can see that the trends are moving in the right direction. There's parallel trends there prior to the reforms. After the reforms, things go gangbusters in Victoria. Off the charts in terms of enrolments. In terms of the proportion enrolled in VET study, again, this is from the VET PC collection. In 2008, there's about 6.3% of people of the population, 25 to 54, enrolled in study. By 2012, that goes up to 11.2%. So this is a change of about 4.9 or 5 percentage point increase in this period. So that's huge. In New South Wales, not much happened. So this again provides some sort of surety that New South Wales is a reasonable counterfactual. And the difference, which as I explained before, is just the differences in the growth, we assign about a 4 percentage point increase in enrolment rates due to the VTG in this time. So remember I said that one of the things we're worried about with using the VET PC data is that it's just publicly funded courses, it's not all enrolments. So that's why we wanted to try and compare the changes in the participation rates using the VET PC to changes in the VET participation rates using the Survey of Education and Employment. And unfortunately, these are the estimates of the participation rates from the ABS Survey of Education and Work. And they don't look anything like those from the VET PC data. One thing to notice is that these are supposed to represent all enrolments, not just publicly provided enrolments. And for some reason, they actually show lower rates of enrolment than the VET PC. So this is kind of an inconsistent story. And this is based on survey data. And anyway, I know that there are people from the ABS, and I'd like to pick your brains about why you think that you might get differences in participation rates using survey-based data as opposed to the ABS, as opposed to the VET provider collection data. But it's a bit of a shame. So, Keyline results. These are some of the major results. And as I say, these are only preliminary, but these represent the... I should actually change the heading's not quite right. These represent the increase in the proportion of enrolments in skill shortage areas, not impacts on enrolment. So this is the impacts on a percentage of enrolments in skill shortage areas. So starting from the left, these little skinny bars, what they represent is basically the degree of uncertainty around the estimates. If you've got really wide bars, you've got uncertain estimates. Small bars are precise estimates. The important thing is that none of these kind of represent like the reasonable range of the estimates. None of these contain 0. These are all statistically significant results. So overall, we find that these reforms for 25 to 54-year-olds increased the proportion of enrolments in skill shortage areas by around 5.5 percentage points. The second bar, remember I said one of the mechanisms through which the reforms may have occurred is through changes in the composition of students. When we control for the composition of student changes, we find that the effect goes up a little bit. That's because the students who came into the system, they were kids typically, I shouldn't say they were kids, these are people who were typically wouldn't have chosen courses in skill shortage areas. So when you control for that, the effect's even bigger. And then finally, when you control for changes in the composition of the providers, the effect is even larger. And this is because private providers who came in typically offered courses that were not as closely aligned in skill shortage areas as public providers. And there's good reasons for that. I'm happy to talk about why private providers didn't offer courses. They did offer courses that were in the skill shortage area, but a smaller proportion of their enrolments were in these areas. So this is the most interesting graph, I think. So this tells us, this tells us a lot about the variation in the response across different groups that we think are typically disadvantaged. So explaining again what these are, the dark blue bar represents the impacts for those who are a group member. So this is the impact for those who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And this blue bar is basically everyone else who is not an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So what you can see, and this is the difference, the yellow bar is the difference between these two. So what this tells us is that Indigenous people, when they were given a voucher, overall they did increase their enrolments in areas related to skills shortage lists. So they did increase their enrolments in skills shortage areas. They didn't respond to the same extent as people who were not Indigenous. And one thing to take note is that it's quite similar, these results are quite similar between the Indigenous people and also the rural people. And I think it's because private providers didn't really, yes, there were private providers who did move into rural areas, but they tended to concentrate more in urban areas. So there's thin vet markets in rural areas outside of urban areas, and so they didn't benefit to the same degree. So this is not necessarily related to problems with Indigenous making poor choices. It's more because of where they were. People with disability, again, they didn't respond in the same way. So people with disability didn't take up the voucher to enrol in skill shortage areas to the same extent as people without a disability. This is really interesting. I like this. I like this one. So this is English as a second language. Basically, these are people who speak a language other than English at home. And what you can see is it's going off the charts. So this is saying that people who come to this country, this tells you something about the skill migration scheme, yeah? So people who have come to this country to get access to the labour market, because they've come here to get access to the labour market, they're more incentivised or more motivated to find jobs that are going to lead to good outcomes. So this is really supporting your skill migration program. Unemployed, importantly, and surprisingly, we don't find any differences between those who are unemployed and employed prior to their at the time of enrolment, which is quite surprising. I kind of assume that those who are out of work when they went into vet would be less likely to enrol in skill shortage areas. And this is the other really important result here, and that's for those who don't have Year 12 or equivalent. There's basically no change in their patterns of enrolment after the reforms. So they're not responding to skill shortage areas like those people who do have Year 12 or equivalent. So if anything, I think what this is saying is that the entitlement or the voucher system is not really benefiting those people without minimum education. And this is consistent with literature in the United States looking at who takes advantage of private school vouchers in the US. What they find is that that the voucher scheme is inequitable, and one of the reasons why it is inequitable because people who are not educated don't take up the voucher to the same extent, and it's related to information. So they claim, and there's lots of studies that have proved that actually if you give people with low levels of education more accessible information about the outcomes from education and also the outcomes from different schools, then they do respond. So tentatively I'm saying that this could well be because those people who don't have a Year 12 or equivalent don't have access to the information about skill shortage areas like the rest of the community. And just finally, the last two bars, they just show no difference in CEFA. So if you're from the bottom 20%, so CEFA is socioeconomic, it's a measure of socioeconomic status. So this is saying that it doesn't matter whether you're from a poor area or you're from a rich area, all else equal, you respond in the same way. And then finally, older students don't respond in the same way as younger students. So just tentative conclusions. For 25 to 54-year-olds, the Victorian entitlement is associated with large increases in publicly funded VET participation, at least measured by the VETMIS or VET PC. Increases are across age groups, but there's insufficient data to really rule out this substitution between fee-for-service and publicly funded VET. The introduction of an entitlement appears to have improved the responsiveness of VET to skill needs, which is a good thing, at least measured by response to skill shortage occupations. And there's large variation in mature age responses to greater freedom of course choice. Some implications. The entitlement does seem to enhance, or at least support, Australia's skilled migration program, but I guess concerningly, a lack of low-skilled or poorly educated people does raise concerns about equity because they're not going to benefit to the same extent. And there's heaps to do. So this is still very preliminary. I haven't really looked at I haven't done any of the sensitivity analysis. Haven't looked at the common trends assumptions. So take it with a grain of salt. Thanks.
You actually finished a couple of minutes before time. Amazing. Any questions for Cain?
What year was the V2G implemented?
So it was rolled out over a number of years. So for this age group, it wasn't really fully implemented to 2011. So unfortunately, we only have a 2-year window to actually examine it because in July 2012, the government wound back a lot of the reforms. They didn't wind it back, but they introduced some other reforms that basically meant that they had more control over the sector. So they targeted subsidies to courses that they thought were in demand. So it's gone full circle. The government sort of lost control. There was a budget blowout too in Victoria, so that meant there was a lot of pressure, and given the GFC, given the tighter financial position of the Victorian government, they were under a lot of pressure to wind back these reforms. So they did that in some degree by by changing the subsidies, reducing subsidies in areas where there was perceived to be no demand or little demand.
Can I ask why you chose the national skill shortage list and not the Victorian data?
Okay, so we've done both. Actually, we've done both, and in fact the results are when we use the Victorian state data, the results are quite different. But one of the main reason is because when you do that, we'd have to use the state-based stuff from New South Wales. And there's always the risk that there's been some change. This is just pure, it's kind of like a geeky thing. Yeah. But there's always the risk that a bureaucrat in New South Wales changed the system at some point that we don't know about, and it didn't happen in Victoria, and that could all drive the results. So when I say some geek some bureaucrat changed the system, it would mean that they just changed the way that they evaluated skill shortages, because this is all it's all kind of hidden away and no one really knows how they do it. If it was done more transparently and it was a consistent approach across the states, we'd have a lot more confidence in being able to do that. So all I can say is that when we do use the state staff, the results are a bit different, but they're still positive, which is kind of good. But yeah, we're kind of a little bit worried about the methodology used.
Hi, very interesting, Cain. I think we're going to have to be a bit careful about what you call it. There's no uniform entitlement system in Australia, you know.
No.
What you're looking at is a specific example in a specific state, and it's very interesting in that you have found that students aren't that stupid.
Yeah.
Which is an issue at the moment, whether we've actually got more choice or less choice. But having looked at all the other entitlement models, I think you need to be clear that you're talking about a model that doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
But
So,
was very important at the time. And the only slide though, on your differences to differences, the fact that there is all those government dollars in there, if you look at, you know, when you put where New South Wales went, compared with Victoria, we do have to remember that they had to double their budget to get there.
Oh, there's no doubt.
Yeah, so
this is not exactly. This is not a study about cost effectiveness.
No,
that's a
but in
different,
terms of proving that students choose reasonably well, with some others that might be some informed, it's a very important study to show that, because at the moment everyone's supposedly saying there's choice when there's less, I think. We'll talk about that tomorrow, but yeah, so...
That's a good point.
Yeah, just...
I'll take that.
Yeah, because there's no such thing as a national entitlement.
No.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly.
There are entitlements.
No. So this is not about, this is broader than an evaluation of the Victorian scheme. This is more about saying if you throw a heap of money at students and let them choose whatever they want, do they make good decisions in an environment where there was relatively few restrictions on the choices that kids made? Yeah. That's all we're saying. So it's not really an evaluation of the VTG. May have come across that way. The other thing taken to on the point about this system is it just grew enormously.
Yes.
What that means is that we're taking in kids or people who are further down the distribution. They're more and more disadvantaged. So we're pulling in people who would not have been in vet. These are people who are, you know, we've all seen stories on the ABC about, you know, unscrupulous providers dragging disadvantaged people into the system. But given that we still find positive effects, it's kind of encouraging. So we're saying that we're taking in people who are more disadvantaged, potentially may not have the same skills and expertise and life experiences to make good choices, but overall we still find that they are doing that. And I guess we do show that the changes in the characteristics still they're only a small part of the overall story. But yeah. Right.
Hi, thank you. That is actually a really interesting data set, so thank you for putting it out in front of us like that. My questions relate mostly to that disadvantaged group that you've identified.
Yep.
So the low skilled, often from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, often from an early school leaver background.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the way you propose to do further research on them, and I'm doing that, I guess, from a slightly biased perspective in that I work my research is in the high school choice field. And I would, I guess, caution against making an assumption that it's a result of poor choices, as you've highlighted, or even a lack of information, though I'm sure that is probably a factor. But I think there are other barriers to entry that you would also need to capture. And I think the barriers to entry also relate to some of the private providers and whether they are, in fact, trying to recruit this bunch of potentially high needs students. So I'm just curious as to where you're interested in taking this now.
So, I mean, one of the things we are looking at is course choice. So obviously course choice, but we're also looking at engagement. So we want to look at which groups responded in terms of enrolments. So we have done some of that, and it's very preliminary. But we are kind of interested in where people enrol and whether to what extent is the engagement for the disadvantaged groups the same as for the more advantaged groups. So we've done some analysis on not on this group, but on the 15 to 19 year olds, and we do find that in terms of enrolments, they do, for most of these groups, they do tend to respond in the same way. So there doesn't seem to be the barriers, and I fully understand that there are barriers to entry for a lot of these disadvantaged groups, but we don't find big differences for the 15 to 19-year-olds. So people from this group, for instance, those who don't have Year 12 or equivalent, they respond in terms of enrolments, proportions who are enrolled, they respond in the same way as those who have got a Year 12 or equivalent. So there's no differences in terms of enrolments. But that's for the 15 to 19-year-olds. I'm not so sure about these guys.
Yeah, and in terms of the enrolments, are you then going to track it to completions, which will be the
Okay, so we've done completion stuff for the 15 to 19-year-olds as well, and overwhelmingly it's surprising. Like the benefit that there is no. I mean, overall students do tend to they have a greater attachment to study, so they're more likely to complete. And mind you, and again, I'm thinking back to the other study. A lot of it is because a lot of it's to do with private providers.
Yeah.
So private providers historically have had higher completion rates, and when you increase the share of provision that is private provision, then you're going to get an increase. So private providers are better at keeping kids in enrolment. Now, whether that's a quality story or whether it's maybe they've lowered the bar, it's really hard to interpret that story. So quality is a big issue.
Yeah.
And
No, I mean, I think it's a really good space to be working in.
No.
But how and what method do you use when you're sort of pulling apart those factors? Is it a statistical analysis, or are you going into some qualitative as well? Or
I mean, I'd love to, if anyone's interested in doing qualitative research, I'd love to find a qualitative researcher that can help me in this area, because it's something that, I'd like to do more of. Because I think that some of this, while we can paint these big picture stories, it's really hard to know in practice what's going on. That's why the qualitative research, I think, would really complement this type of analysis. I'm not a qualitative researcher. I'm happy to work with qualitative researchers, but I'd love to do more work on this. Yes.
I'm just wondering, to use our disability side, is there, and this is personal interest, so is there ability to discriminate between, say, the mental health disability, which is more episodic in its disability than most other physical or other types of disability? Is there room to discriminate that information out? Because I don't know how the data's collected.
So this is the thing.
And if so, what would it take to do that?
It will take me about 10 minutes. I could do that really easily. And that's the great thing about the vet provider collection, because it's such a big data set. You can split the data up in any way you like. So we can look at individual. I'm just trying to think how the disability categories work. But there certainly is a mental health. There's intellectual. There's a variety of them. So we can chop that up in any which way. Yeah. For sure, and that's a good suggestion.
It's simply because you're also looking at entrance into an accessibility. So, and that particular group find it very difficult to access that sort of training. And if they do access it, there's more dropout because of the episodic nature of the disability. So it would be good to look at some of the statistical data and be able to change what you're doing in an RTO to support them more individually.
No, that's
so
good.
I think what you're doing is really good research.
No. I'll take it on board. That's good suggestion.
Do we have time for one more question? Or
Did you manage to get to look at employment outcomes?
Good question. So I was bashing up poor Luke there, sitting next to you from the ABS, about trying to get access to employment outcome data from census. So we have done employment outcome stuff using the student outcome survey, but it's only, the thing about the student outcome survey, as I was telling Luke about at lunchtime, is it only gives you employment outcomes 6 months out from study. And what we find is, not for this, we haven't done it for this group, but we've done it for the 15 to 19-year-olds, we do find that it doesn't have any effect on employment outcomes. So we're not finding increases in the probability of employment following study, but what we do find is increases in earnings. So students are finding occupations that are higher paid, which is kind of consistent with this story. but not necessarily increases in employment. But that could be just because of the way that employment's defined in the data too. So we're not discriminating between casual employment and full-time employment, it's just employment. But there doesn't seem to be an employment. But long term, what we really want to do is to be able to look at, we want to look at the outcomes to say 2000 up to 2015. So we want to see outcomes longer term, because that's the only way you can really get at issues of quality. I think it's just looking at the outcomes over time.
And sorry, could you just remind us, at that point between 9, 10, 11, what level of fee were they charging the students at that point? Because everything's changed.
Everything was very. It was. It was around. There was no more than $1,000 a year. That's the cap.
Right.
But on average, it was around $200 in fees. I think.
So I'm going to have to cut it off here. So just please thank Cain for a very interesting presentation.